The 1930s depression was a major event in Australian history. There have been other depressions in Australia, but this one was the most recent. It was worldwide and it had a great impact on people's lives. The Great Depression, they call it. Well, not great if you're unemployed, evicted and queuing up at a soup kitchen. And that's the image we have of the Depression. This is a slum house. It's at the Museum of Victoria in Melbourne, and it's a reconstruction of a house that stood not far from here in a Little Melbourne Lane area until the 1980s. It's the sort of image you see in your history books about the Depression period, and it gives us some sense of what life must have been like for the people who lived here.
Of course, life got worse for some people. This is Newtown on Sydney's south side, and there were many eviction battles here in the 1930s. Landlords would evict tenants because they couldn't pay the rent, and sometimes resistance was organised, especially when police were brought in to supervise the evictions. Trade unionists, World War I veterans came in here to resist. This street is very famous, and at 143 Union Street a very bitter battle occurred all those years ago, involving fists, involving boots, involving bottles, batons and guns. The Sydney Morning Herald at the time reported it in these terms: the most sensational eviction battle Sydney has ever known was fought between 40 policemen and 18 communists at 143 Union Street, Newtown. All defenders were injured, some seriously, and at least 15 of the police were treated by ambulance officials. This incident became known as Bloody Friday. Of course, there were many other eviction battles all around the country, and they didn't always involve political activists. Mainly veterans, unemployed people, and sometimes trade unionists were involved. But it was not all like that, and here's the contrast. This is Wallara, one of Sydney's wealthier suburbs, and I've come here to test a common image of the Depression. The image that the rich got richer, or that they were unaffected by the years of the Depression. Historian Drew Cottle, in his article The Sidney Rich in the Great Depression, can help me gather some evidence to test that perception. He looked at the municipal records of the time, and he found that during the Depression in this area there were something like 500 new garages built at an average cost of £70. Now that would be half an annual average wage at that time. Some of the other renovations in this area: one of the lots, lot 32, £1,500. Another one would have been lot 2, and that was £3,000. One of the houses around here, Ginnagulla Estate in Victoria Road, £30,000. The average person at that time could never earn that much money in a lifetime. Now, the first impression that I've got from my study of the Depression is that the working class suffered and the upper class prospered. But as we know, first impressions are not always the most accurate impressions. So I've come to the National Museum, talking to my friend Daniel Oakman, who is a curator here, and he's kindly pulled out some fascinating objects, and we're going to use these objects to test that first impression. Daniel, can you tell me what all these objects are?
Yeah, well, these are a great selection of objects that are really from our collections relating to the Great Depression of the 1930s. And if we start with this dress here, it's actually a fancy dress.
Okay.
That was made during the 1930s for a competition. And it was by a family who were struggling, and the father had been retrenched. He was working for the Shell Petroleum Company. And he and his family got together and they made this dress out of old curtains for his daughter. And in an effort to try and win this competition, it was the first prize was a cash prize. But it's the patterns on this dress that really tell the story about the way the family was dealing with the Depression. I think what's important to really think about here with these images is just the extent and the kind of shocking calamity that unemployment created. And at the height of the Depression in 1932, unemployment was reaching about 30%. So this was an extraordinarily damaging thing for anyone, not just lower class workers, but also for skilled workers. So you can see here, there's plumbers, the people who are looking for odd jobs for plumbers. So there's a skilled tradesmen looking for work that have been put out of work. But really, you've got people with particular skills looking to do absolutely anything, from gardening, cleaning windows, absolutely anything. If you go around here, you can see.
Boilermakers,
Boilermakers,
pipe fitters, engine drivers, even. All
Yep.
on our books. Okay.
Yep. Odd jobs, even one up here for accounts and correspondence. As I said, that was the community really coming together to try and grapple with the problems of the Depression. It wasn't just men who were looking for work, but it's also women too who were looking to try and help out, performing jobs and raising money for their families. Yeah, so we can get quite a detailed picture about the kind of things that people were doing.
What would all these things tell me? What would be the dominant image that would come through in your mind? What leaps into your mind when you just see these things?
I mean, two things come to my mind. One is the extraordinary impact that this had on society, and the other was the way that ordinary people dealt with that impact, and the kind of the resourcefulness that did come through, and the coming together in the absence of other welfare setups and other kind of government-sponsored safety nets.
Yes.
The people did come together and made do and work to support each other.
Okay, Daniel, what have you got here? This looks like something out of a sideshow.
Yeah.
What's this got to do with the Depression?
It does. This is what we call the saw doctor's wagon, and it belonged to a fellow called Wright, and he arrived in Australia in 1930 in the height of the Depression.
Okay.
And with the little money that he had, he purchased this wagon and adapted it into a workshop and his home. And he, from 1935, he went on the road and offering his services as a knife sharpener and kind of a general handyman, repairing tools and so forth. But it was also his home. So in here is essentially a caravan, and on the other side is a workshop. And he initially had it attached to, was drawn by two horses. And later on, it was attached to a light truck, and in the final stages of its life, to this small tractor.
Okay.
He remained on the road from 1935 until he died in 1969.
Okay.
And but along the way, he got married and had a daughter, and they all continued to live and work out of this extraordinary vehicle.
While some people like Harold may have experienced independence, there were also others who felt shame, feelings of worthlessness, and even despair. But amidst all of this were glimpses of hope. Travelling theatres were popular, and people could still go to the beach or to the racetrack. Now, Lena, you brought me to a very strange exhibit here. Can you tell me what it is, and what does it have to do with the 1930s Depression?
Well, this is Farlap's heart. Now, Farlap was a racehorse who was racing during the late 1920s and early 1930s. Indeed, was probably the most successful racehorse at that time in Australia. He had 14 wins in a row in 1930 and 1931 and seemed absolutely invincible. He was dominating the race scene. Now, as you mentioned, this is a time of depression and good news stories were few and far between. So a horse that just kept winning really made for some positive news for people.
Now, is it too strong a statement to say that a horse like Farlap would have given people a lot of hope during that dismal time?
I don't think that's too far to go, actually. There's the marvel of the story about Farlap is that in some ways it's a rags to riches story. His first race, terrible, didn't do well at all. But then from about 1929 onwards, he started winning and he started to get people's notice. And so then when he won the 1930 Melbourne Cup as the favourite with a massive weight of about 62.5 kilos on him, he was really elevated to that status of hero, gone from that scrawny horse that he was to, you know, a real triumph and a hero for the people. So I think a rags to riches story and a good news story for people during the Depression.
What do all of these objects, the dress, the saw doctor's wagon, the slum house, the story of Farlap, and the contrasting suburbs in Sydney tell us about life during the Great Depression? Do they confirm or contradict the images that we saw in the Circa presentation? Some people who lived through the Depression actually say that it was a good time for them. How can this be? How might Harold, the saw doctor, answer this question?
And what about these men? The diggers from World War I who returned to unemployment. Well, very soon they became diggers again, working for 2 or 3 days a week on public projects such as the Great Ocean Road here in Victoria. What would they say about the Depression? In history, we're asked to empathise, to imagine what life was like at a certain time, at a certain place. But without hard evidence, that imagination is just fiction, not fact. And if we're not careful, popular images can feed that imagination, and quickly that becomes the core or essence of the experience. So when you're studying the Great Depression, challenge those popular images. Use the information and the evidence in the Australian History Mystery Kit to work out for yourselves what life was really like during the Great Depression.